It's been a minute since I have made a tier list. Part of that is just kind of I forgot. Part of it is also that it's taken a while for the metagame to kind of develop. Because it opened up in such a big way that there were a lot more options available. And I've only felt comfortable fairly recently with putting down a list like this because it just took everyone more time to figure it out because there were so many more options and there was so much more to test. And we only get so much data if we're not competing at a top level, which I am not. I'm not in those scrims. I'm not in the late tournament matches. I can only see what is broadcast. And so that limits my ability to track the metagame to an extent. And I can't be providing quite as up to the minute a perspective on it. I have to take some time to process and see some matches and how they actually play out in tournaments before I can say anything. So let's get into what it's been recently. This is pretty well established at this point that Tacticooler is pretty much mandatory at a top level. You just kind of need to be running it. And this is for very good reason. Back when Tacticooler first came out, a lot of people were really worried it was going to be broken. A lot of people were worried that it was going to be necessary to run, it's going to be meta-defining, and it wasn't at first, and then they buffed it, and now it's basically exactly what we were afraid it was going to be. If you don't take a Tacticooler against an opponent who does take a Tacticooler, you have to win more fights to be able to score the same amount to be able to win the game. You just need to do more work. You need to beat them more times. Because if they have a cooler and you take two of them out, those two are going to be back up by the time you get the next two. So every fight kind of feels like a 6v4. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that when you get a wipe, instead of being able to, paint up in mid, get some map control, by the time you're done with that fight, there's already someone in position to defend. You're not going to get anywhere near as much of the map for splatting players who have Tacticooler. And these teams are generally going to be well set up to have someone to jump into, in part because the single best weapon in the game, in my opinion, is the Snipewriter 5H. And it's just going to be in a safe position because it gets value from just being in a safe position and painting for cooler and doing very little else. When it shoots at somebody, it's just doing that because it can both paint for cooler and shoot at that person at the same time. That's kind of how you think about this weapon. It is very, very paint support heavy. It's very similar to how late game Splatoon 2 Jet Squelchers played, where it spams a whole bunch of paint on the map from very safe positions that aren't really worth it to contest. It does enough damage fast enough to discourage someone from trying to just rush it down. It doesn't have the major charge time issue that, say, a really slow Splatling will have, or a particular charger will have, because for one charge it gets multiple shots. So even if you miss one of them, you've still got another couple. You've still got, missing one, you can splat two people with your remaining charge, which you can't do on any other charger. So it's not very, it's not incredibly deadly in terms of trying to get raw splats, but it doesn't have to. It can just paint the map, and paint the map really, really well. It gets cooler about as fast as anything else possibly can. It and the Zap are pretty close in their cooler output. But the Snipewriter is going to be able to paint from much further back and take much safer positions while it paints, it's much less likely to go down and lose its cooler than an N-Zap is. And so that's why I have it at the very top here. It also has a suppressing effect on a lot of other weapons, and I think we'll talk more about that as we go down the list. Like, we've got this in meta-defining tier for a reason, but I think we'll see those reasons as we come down to further weapons down on the list and go, see, the reason that this doesn't work is because pencil. So I'd say that that is the strongest, most meta-defining weapon in the entire game right now, that everything else is a response to pencil being as strong as it is. If you're not playing a pencil, then you're playing one of the next 3 weapons on your team comp. You're playing a Zap, you're playing a Tri-Nouveau, or you're playing a Heavy Edit. Dynamo is another option, but we'll talk about why that's a lot less desirable further down. I think there are niche situations where it might work, but you're probably better off picking one of these 3. And these come in a few different flavors. The N-Zap is one really aggressive option that's very paint positive. If you want to run kind of a backless comp and just run at them, then this is a pretty solid cooler user to go for. So also is the Tri-Nouveau. But the N-Zap can play a bit more supportively. It has a lethal bomb it can throw still. It has a lot of paint output, and so if you're worried about paint output in like zones or something, sure, the Tri-Nouveau can make up for a lot of it with its fizzy bombs, but it kind of has to be slaying to be able to get as much. And the N-Zap will get a much higher cooler output for that extra paint, which is one of the big things that makes me put it above the Tri-Nouveau. The Tri-Nouveau is the best cooler weapon at fighting. It's just, you get so much value out of cooler, why fight? Why not just secure the cooler and then do something? And this is going to give you by far the fewest coolers out of any of the options that someone's seriously considering. This is a weapon that uses its coolers a little bit more selfishly. It tries to go in and feed after it gets its cooler. So this can work if you have like a bucket player who's really aggressive and is going to be capable of using that, and you just want everybody else on some other weapon. But you're going to get fewer of the coolers, and you have to consider the value that you're losing compared to having something like one of the other 3 options in the tier here. You need to be getting value out of that AoE. You need to be getting value out of that fizzy bomb. There needs to be something about the Tri-Nouveau that you want more than you want 4 extra coolers over the course of a game. It can be about that much. It generally is about that much. You're going to see something like 8 out of a Zap or a pencil. You're going to see like 4 a lot of the time out of a Tri-Nouveau in a full-length game. The fizzy bomb can be something if you're trying to combo with it. You know, it has the movement option of the fizzy bomb to get itself into more aggressive positions. But 4 more coolers, is that worth it to your team? The answer is often yes. I would usually probably go with the pencil, Zap if I don't have someone who can play a charger, basically. The heavy edit, I'm conflicted about, because I'm hearing a lot of opinions and reports that it's really strong. It paints very well for cooler, you have to give it that. And it's, you know, got decent range that's very deadly to try and push into as a frontline weapon. But it's a weapon that just kind of gets bodied by the Snipewriter. It is much shorter range than the Snipewriter, and the Snipewriter, mind you, is part of the reason we're not seeing Ballpoint anymore. Ballpoint is beaten pretty badly by the Snipewriter because the Snipewriter still has more range than it, and it also counters the Inkjet pretty well. But the heavy edit has even less range and even less of a way to do anything about the pencil. So while in a vacuum, heavy edit could absolutely be one of the strongest weapons in the game, when you compare it to what is the number 1 weapon in the game right now, I just don't see that much of a reason to prefer it. The lack of a bomb for poking up over ledges and stuff makes it very, very vulnerable to someone who has high ground over it. And being as short range as it is, it kind of has to drop down into low ground just to get in range a lot of the time. So a pencil can stand on high ground and look at this thing and it just can't play the game except against the Snipewriter's teammates. Now, you've got the whole Splatling's Charger dynamic going on between those two, where a Charger, a traditional Charger one-shots, and so it has a better kill time than the Splatling, and so the 1v1 it kind of gets to bully the Splatling, but the Splatling has a better matchup against the rest of the Charger's teammates, and so it tries to kind of play keep away and avoid the Charger while doing as much damage as it can to that Charger's frontline. But the Pencil having the rapid fire capability is a little bit less like that. As a Charger, it's a little bit more capable of doing damage to multiple players on the enemy team than your typical Charger is. So even that advantage of the Splatlings is offset. And this is definitely not one of the better Splatlings to try and play that kind of game with. So I would put it in this order. I'd say Pencil, Zap, Tri-Nouveau, and Heavy Edit for Tacticooler options. You gotta pick one of them. Pencil's probably your best bet. If you don't have someone who can play a Pencil, you almost certainly have someone on your team that can play a Shooter or a Bucket, and you run one of those two. And if you really need to put it on your Splatling, if that Splatling player is really unwilling to play a Pencil, I guess you can run Heavy Edit. I just don't see a use case personally for it. Next, these are the options that you pick with your big cooler weapons. So, cooler, most important special in the game, but you're only gonna run one of them. At most we've ever seen at top level, you run two, and that was a very strange comp that nobody's tried to replicate from a Japanese team. It worked, and so maybe there's more, looking into that it deserves, but it definitely didn't catch on, at least in the West. So, what else do you run in addition to your absolutely critical cooler weapon? Well, one of the things that you need to immediately consider is that the cooler is not a special that's going to move the enemy team. It's not displacement. It's not something that's going to move the enemy team out of some place where they're, set up and ready to defend. So you need something that's going to do that. That's one thing you're looking for. Another thing you're looking for is to consider what cooler enables. Cooler is going to make it so that the enemy team wants to run at you with fast-paced weapons and just take fights at overwhelming speeds. To shut that down, midline slaying weapons have become massively important in the metagame. What counters a short-range shooter running at you? It's these first four weapons in this tier. This is kind of what they're for. They're here to make it so that your cooler doesn't get as much value because you're just running yourself into the brick wall that is, say, a Squeezer. Squeezer has always been one of the best main weapons in the entire game. One of the reasons that it's popping off quite as hard as it is right now is that it has a pretty good matchup against the Pencil. You can wall off its shots. It doesn't really want to waste them on trying to break your wall down. And you have a pretty fast kill time at pretty much a similar range. Obviously, it's not quite as far ranged as the Pencil is, but it's close enough that you can often get close to it before it knows you're there. You also have a Zuka you can just pop on it, which is one of the best answers to Pencil. Just delete it with a Zuka before it even sees that coming, and can get its Tacticooler off. That's something I, as a shot player, often try to do, is to aim that at the Pencil, not only because it's going to get rid of the cooler, but also because it's just going to relieve a lot of pressure on my team and allow them to move through mid without just randomly taking 68 damage from getting tagged once. But another thing about the Squeezer is that frontline weapons hate this thing. It's really hard to push against. It's almost as fast to splat as a lot of, Slayer weapons are, but it just hits from further away. And so it's really, really hard to do something about as the frontline weapon. So it deals with the Snipewriter really well. It also deals with the teammates that want to run with a Snipewriter. So it's a fantastic weapon to bring out. You generally want to have a midline Slayer weapon on a comp, at least, something that's got a little bit more range, that's going to be able to eat the pressure of everybody running at it all at once, and pick those tacticoolered up players off so that they just kind of go back to spawn and have to reset and don't get any more value out of their tacticooler than giving the enemy team an easy splat for very little investment. Range Blaster is another great option right now, in part because AoE has become so important. Again, Snipewriter, one of the things it's not going to like is something that has the range to be able to reach it, so Range Blaster helps out with that a little bit. But another part is that it's a line of sight weapon, and line of sight weapons are going to struggle when an AoE weapon is able to use cover against them. So a Range Blaster can definitely threaten that if it needs to, but Range Blaster is also just really good, again, against someone trying to run at it. It's if you get hit by a Range Blaster as a short-ranged weapon and you're not already in range, already doing damage, you just have to disengage, back up, completely reconsider what it was you were just doing. It's a big waste of time at the cost of, again, the Range Blaster just firing a single shot. So very low investment, high defensive capability for fending off something like a Tacticooler push. The Splatana Stamper, similar role, extremely long range on that charge slash. This thing bullies frontliners out of the positions where they're trying to set up with their specials or where they're trying to paint in between fights, and it's just kind of very safe doing that. Another thing that the Splatana Stamper does really well is combo damage. It really loves to play for that. It's got burst bombs, and it's also got the charge slash, which, like we said, reaches a ridiculously long way. So if someone's tagged by, say, the Stamper, someone gets hit by the vertical slash, they can call for the pencil to aim in that direction, and that might get something. So you can kind of do combo damage that way, but it's also perfectly capable of pushing in and fighting more aggressively. So you're not losing as much by picking a long-ranged weapon there, because you're still able to push around corners and whatnot as you need to move people out of the way. Then we've got the Vanilla Slosher. The V-Slosher is one of the go-to weapons right now for this kind of midline Slayer role. It shuts down a lot of those more frontline kind of weapons, but it's still able to push up and play really aggressively with the rest of its team. You've maybe seen me picking it up a little bit recently because I think it fits really well into a Slayer play style, and it's just something that's been useful to have to be able to flex to on my team recently. The strikes are a little bit of kind of a filler special for it, but it works pretty well. Strikes are really strong on tower. They're very solid on zones. You never hate to have strikes on your team. It's decent for moving people out of the way, and being the V-Slosher, it also gets a splat bomb that it can combo with those strikes to cover a lot more ground on the map by throwing bomb, tri-strike, bomb, and that can be a pretty devastating combination that you can use to then chip someone down with the half damage slosh, between 50 and 70. So it's really found a strong place in the current metagame. Bucket players have been doing pretty well recently. You've got the V-Slosher you can work with, you've got the Tri-Nouveau you can work with, and all of those are top-tier options. And then we can see just one tier down below. All of these weapons can totally work in the right situation. So bucket players have a lot of variety available to them if they want to go for that playstyle. Splattershot. This is my main. I think it's still very strong. At top level, you really want to consider a squeezer. The thing is, there are only so many people who are willing to play a squeezer. The shot does fill a significantly different role. It's much more of a paint support. It has a lethal bomb. It's short range, so it's able to push in more aggressively. So you're rearranging, kind of shuffling the valuable traits that you need on your team around if you pick a shot over a squeezer. Because now you have different holes in your comp that need to be filled, depending on which of the two you pick. But It's just very versatile. It's a short-range shooter. You know, plenty has been said about the value of their maneuverability and their high paint output, their ability to play basically any role in the game, provided that they have a lethal bomb, which this one does. So you can, you know, skirmish a little bit by just moving around and being hard to hit. You can slay really well. Very fast kill time, very maneuverable weapon, able to get in there, paint for itself, and get the job done. And you can even sit back and anchor a little bit if you want to. If you don't have a way in, you can sit back. You're very paint positive, so putting paint out on the ground is still helping your team. Once you get a special, you can snipe someone with it, so you can sit back from that more passive position and shoot at someone, maybe give someone a jump while you're doing it. And you still have bombs, which you can use as sort of a discount AoE option that you can throw at a backline weapon that you want to have to move so that your teammate can get through an area. It can kind of just do a little bit of everything, but the things that it does specialize in, it does really well still. So, very valuable weapon to have on a team. You're never complaining to have one, and plenty of people are going to know how to play it because it's just been such a popular, omnipresent weapon in the metagame for such a long time. Splash has made a little bit of a comeback. It dropped off a little bit, but Crab is starting to become a lot more valued than it used to be. The ability to lock down an area for a longer amount of time is really nice when you've got tacticoolered up teams that are trying to run at you. Because what they would love for you to do is to just give up ground. But unlike something like a Zuka, a Crab is going to be out there for a pretty long time. Unless you're able to find an angle on it and hit it with some AoE or something, it's kind of just going to exist there for a while. And that can buy your team a lot of time to make it back in if, for example, your cooler player goes down and you need to reset while they're trying to rush you. It can make it so that you have enough time to just set up a push however you want and then get people in there and follow up with it. Chip damage is, again, really good right now. Comboing that with Snipewriter damage is really nice. So it's got some factors that are bringing it back in. We're seeing a lot more Splash than we have in the recent, maybe last few months. And I feel pretty comfortable putting it back up here. It's something that, again, a lot of people know how to play back from Crab meta. So there's going to be a lot of strong options in terms of players to choose from who can pick this thing up and run it on your team. Next up, these are options that are very easy to plug into any meta comp just because you feel like it. They're options that mesh really well with whatever else that you're trying to play in the meta. They're often just kind of variants on what is the meta right now, things that play pretty much the same role as a weapon above, but in a slightly different way that you might prefer. I wouldn't say that you want to, like, solo main these weapons, just make them the only thing you play. Maybe that's a little different with something like Tent. But for the most part, they're weapons that are alternatives to what you're playing above here. There's something where you just want a different kit for a different map mode, and you pull this out for that specific reason. So let's talk about the buckets, just kind of going down the line. Let's say you want AoE and don't currently have a Trizuka, and you really want one. Then you've got the Neo Machine. Great option. And there are also some moments where a bucket player might also want the Fizzy Bomb Booyah kit. It's fallen off a little bit recently. It's not the monster that it used to be back on earlier patches, but there are times where you look at your team comp and you're like, you know what, we could use a Booyah Bomb, or we could use a Fizzy Bomb. We don't want a point sensor, we want something that's going to do damage in the sub-weapon slot. And for whatever reason, you know, we don't want strikes, or, you know, we want the machine's hitbox for some other reason. Like, there are definitely reasons to pick it. Even the vanilla Tri, this is a weapon where, you know, on its own in a vacuum would probably be a little bit lower, but it's something that any bucket player can just kind of pick up and use. It's just going to be really similar to something like the Tri Nouveau in its playstyle, But if you want an inkjet, then you can run it. Now, the inkjet option is something that you got to be really careful about. This is the highest up I'm putting an inkjet weapon, and I don't even know if I really... Like, this is one of the weapons that I'm, like, tempted to put down a tier, simply because Snipewriter makes it really hard to run inkjet right now. For one thing, you know, with inkjet, it's fairly high risk, but fairly high reward. If those splats are actually high reward, but if you're splatting someone with Tacticooler, now it's fairly high risk and like moderate to low reward. So that's one problem. Another problem is that the Snipewriter is just really good as a main weapon at shooting inkjets. The inkjet kind of has to get rid of the Snipewriter right away, or else it's going to get hit from like halfway across the map, unless it's totally focusing on the Snipewriter. And the Snipewriter can just back up. If the inkjet decides to try and chase it further, then its shots are going to be reactable because the Snipewriter is so far away, so it can just kind of dodge. Meanwhile, you're moving closer to the Snipewriter. That probably means you're also moving closer to one of these midline Slayer weapons. They're going to pick you off really easily off the back of whatever chip damage the Snipewriter was able to do first. So this is definitely not an inkjet meta, which makes me kind of sad to say. But if there ever is a time that you want to run an inkjet, putting it on your bucket player is definitely a pretty good decision to make for comp building. So there are definitely places where I've looked at a map mode and been like, can we run V-Try here? And people have been like, you know, yeah, that's not a bad idea. Let's do that. And we've had some success doing that. So I feel comfy enough putting it up here, but just know that that's one of the rarer choices that you're going to make in all likelihood. It's up there more because a bucket player can easily flex to it and have one ready to go than it is because the weapon on its own merits would stand quite that high. Similar deal with all of the chargers here, in that they're all up here because you probably have someone playing a Snipewriter, and if they can play a Snipewriter, for one thing, these are really good to have because they're better practice for the Snipewriter aim than the Snipewriter is. The Snipewriter has a bigger hitbox than any of these chargers have. It's harder to hit shots on these things. So if you want to stay up to, you know, up on your charger aim, it might be good to just get some games in occasionally on the leader or the standard charger. If that's an important part for you, then, and you really need to be hitting those shots and you're not doing it quite as well as you want to be, might be a way that you want to go. These are more a Slayer option. This is more putting more of your eggs in one basket than the Snipewriter is. Because the Snipewriter can kind of anchor support all the time and maybe like deal chip damage to support Slayers on the front line. These chargers, they kind of just need to be slaying a lot of the time. They can paint. They absolutely do paint if you decide to use them for that. But if you're looking for a charger that paints, and that's the main thing you want, you're just picking a pencil. So again, if you're picking one of these, it's more of a Slayer option, and you're kind of just relying on your teammate to be good at a charger and be able to hit shots and do traditional charger stuff. Now, if you, for example, have someone who's running like a Zap or a Tri-Slosher Nouveau, and you still have a charger player who wants to play a charger, this could free them up to play one of these options if they think they will get a special value out of, say, Tri-Strikes, or the extra range of an E-Leader, or Ink-Vac, or a Bomb. And any of those options could be something that, depending on your team comp, you really want to have, and that you're willing to take someone off a pencil and put, you know, another player on something like a Zap for instead. You know, taking someone off of a shot and putting them on a Zap, that's not a huge difference. They still have almost the same slaying power. They still have a lethal bomb that they can throw out there. Sure, you know, the special that you're getting isn't quite as big, but you're even getting a little bit more mobility out of them. It's a pretty similar weapon to switch them onto. So basically you can make a value judgment like, taking my shooter player and putting them on a Zap instead, yeah, that's going to decrease their slaying power, but are we going to increase our slaying power more by putting our charger player on one of these weapons? There's definitely a case to be made that a lot of the time that's true. So we are seeing a lot more chargers than we have in the past, in part because the Snipewriter is keeping all of the Splatlings in check. Moving on to Sorella Brella. This one's in a weird place in that there's not a lot of data right now. Now, this is pretty nice for example, being able to wall off the multiple shots from the Snipewriter and like get someone in. This wall synergizes pretty well with other midline Slayer options, and so you can kind of play around that to sneak a squeezer into position where it's hard to get rid of them, and they can just kind of deal damage to anyone they want. And it's also a great distraction. Gets Zuka, which, like we've been saying, is a great option for dealing with something like a pencil. When it's been played recently, it's looked pretty good. I recall a set the Jackbot played on, I think it was Mahi Zones, where they seemed to be liking it. And I just haven't seen that much more of it, so it's really hard for me to judge, as someone who doesn't play it actively, exactly where it's at. I'm putting it roughly here. If Jackpot are running it, there's got to be something that works about it. But that's about the best that I can say, because I'm just not that much of an expert on this weapon. 96 Deco has a very solid Clamblitz niche, and I'm not seeing it get run like anywhere else. The reason you run this is for crack and cheese. If you're trying to play a crack and cheese strategy, this is the weapon you go for. It's just able to exist on the map, play that midline Slayer role that we need, but then also when the time comes, it's going to have its Kraken ready fast enough, and it's going to survive a push well enough that it can reliably get your teammates to jump in there and get the clams dunked. So if that's what you want to do, then this is the weapon you go for, and on Clamblitz, that's pretty successful as a strategy. You see that an awful lot. There aren't very many other Kraken options in the game at all. One of them is a Splatling, which again is going to have a lot of problems against the pencil. So this is often the weapon that job falls to. Foil Squeezer is in a really awkward position in that it has the splatter color screen. And so the splatter color screen, first of all, is something that you might just not be able to play. It might be banned. And beyond all that, it's not even that good. Like, sometimes it just smoke screens your teammates from being able to see the enemy team. Like, there are definitely times where I will just willingly tank screen damage, run through it, and go after someone on the other side, provided I'm not streaming and my viewers, are not going to be subjected to something that might, for all I know, give them headaches. So you're not guaranteed to even be able to run this thing. Even if you can, there's a lot of question of whether you should just run the other kit, because it has a Zuka, and that's going to get you a lot more value. The bomb is a really nice part of the kit, because it's kind of something that the Squeezer wants. It doesn't have the ability to contest an AoE weapon super well, so if one of those were to get under it, an auto bomb is something that could help flush that player out a little bit better. So that does shore up one of its weaknesses. So it's not bad, and there are definitely times where I've seen people using it, again, provided that nobody opted out, that it was allowed to be played at that time. But it's just not something that I would put very high unless it were a kit of a weapon that is one of the top tier meta options at the moment. And it's going to be easy for players who can play the normal Squeezer to be able to flex to it, to take advantage of it on whatever map modes they think it will provide any value to them. Splatana Wiper, it's an aggressive option that's going to get some value out of Tacticooler, which is solid. Hammer is definitely not one of the more sought-after options at the moment, but it has been better recently. I've noticed myself just getting caught by it more often. You can't just sidestep it quite as easily anymore. Slower weapons can just kind of get chased down by the Donkey Kong mode now. The Donkey Kong mode has absolutely ridiculous hitboxes. Like, it hits so much further away from the hammer than it looks like it does. And so there are some corridors it can kind of just eat up by itself. And unless you have a weapon that specifically has kind of the DPS to be able to shoot in between hammer swings, or you've got a flank angle on it, sometimes you kind of just gotta run, or sometimes you're just gonna go down. So hammer has gotten a bit better because of those buffs recently. The main weapon itself is so-so. Again, it can rush things down, and it's very versatile, which is its biggest strength. But I don't think that there's really anything that the Splatana Wiper does in particular that's that much stronger than anything else. Its mobility is probably its best perk, and that's definitely, something to consider. We have the Splat Roller, which is really high on this list specifically because of the curling bomb that it can use to get into stronger positions, which separates it from the bunch by a lot. So mobility is important on an aggressive frontline weapon, but its kill times are not great at really any range. So it's often going to be played more as a skirmisher. It's often going to be played more to kind of annoy someone, to have the threat of being able to rush them or to charge in with the hammer, but it's not something that's going to be applying like super duper constant, I'm going to splat you right now pressure. So I think this is a decent spot for it. It's something that you can put in basically in the place of any of the paint positive weapons like a shooter or something when you want to just have something aggressive you can go in with. The Neo Stamper is a bit less popular recently than the Zipcaster version. I think in part because of the Burst Bomb. The Burst Bomb gives it so much more combo potential, and given that something like Splash is back in the meta, even that we're seeing Fizzy Bombs from the likes of the Tri Nouveau or the Machine, that there are more reasons to maybe play toward that combo damage. But Crab, like we said, has also made a bit of a comeback. And the Neo Stamper does get that. It can play a little bit more of like a passive anchor role, just firing out those charge slashes that do paint a pretty good deal and get you your crab pretty quickly. And so you can kind of have like a backline crab sword hybrid, as opposed to having a frontline weapon that has to back up to crab sometimes. So that can be usable, and given that we're already seeing a lot of Stampers in general, being able to flex to it is just, another reason to pick up Stamper. That you've got multiple options. If your team happens to want certain things at a certain time, you can often just flex to this kit of that weapon to provide those things. 52 Gal, there are like a couple of specific map modes that I personally like to run the 52 Gal on. And it is something that you can run in particular situations where there are particular things you want. The ability to push up really aggressively but have a splash wall is nice. Although, again, the Squeezer being in the meta this much, you're probably not going to see as much of it because you're not really interested in double wall a lot of the time. But maybe you are interested in double wall, and that's actually a pretty good option then. So there are some ideas with it, but a lot of the time it's hard to justify running the whale, because that's a special slot that's not going to be quite as valuable as some other options that you could consider for a shooter. So it's something that I haven't been doing a lot of, but I do still play it from time to time when I think that that's going to be particularly useful. When I need to maybe challenge a tent shield, I'll throw that wall out there. When I need to be pushing through a very tough choke point like ramp on Museum, that's a time that I really love to have the 52 out to be able to force my way through that. When I want to be kind of shot calling and, locating a player and then running them down, Whale can be pretty helpful for that in the middle of a push. So it works. It's just not something I've been playing a lot recently, and I wouldn't put it any higher than this. If anything, I'd maybe put it slightly lower. T-Tech and Neo Splash, these actually play pretty different roles. Not so much in that they're that different of weapons, but if you're picking one or another, it's probably for pretty different reasons. You're generally picking the T-Tech if you want basically someone who was just playing shot to have tri-strikes. This is something that I see often when we've got like double Zuka, but we want something on like tower control to be able to stop the tower. And strikes are generally going to be better for that because they last for longer and are more of a sure thing to kind of clear the entire tower instead of just parts of it. So that's a pretty solid option there if you want to run like one shot, one T-Tech or something. That's something that I've seen a lot of teams be able to form. So that can work. Whereas the Neo Splash, you're probably running for just the raw paint support. This is a popular weapon to run with the Carbon Deco, with something that needs a lot of paint to be able to get in. And then a lot of the time you're using the strikes to smoke screen your sharking teammates to be able to get them in. That's not something I've seen a ton recently, but I see no reason to believe that it couldn't still work, and it is still something that I think Alliance Rogue have done from time to time. So we're still seeing that sort of paint output from that weapon. Not a lot of news on that particular front, but that's the use case I could see for it, and it would still play it well. I see no reason why it would be any less valuable than it was at the time. Red pencil. So this is a new addition to the list since last time we talked. Inkstorm getting a buff is definitely nice for this. It's just kind of hard to justify when, if the main weapon's going to be good there, why not just run the other pencil? Why not just make that your Tacticooler weapon, get all of your, free paint from that position that it's going to like to take. If there's a place that you want to run it and you want to put, one of your frontline weapons or something on one of those other cooler options, and you think that you're going to get a lot of the value out of the rain, sure, run it. Because it's going to be easy to switch over to from the other pencil. It's not going to change your playstyle that much. And there's not going to be a lot more you have to really think about. And maybe, for example, there's a backline matchup where you would much prefer to have a splash wall to, get yourself into position more safely so that the wall can tank a shot and then you can keep firing through it. Given that you have multiple shots, that could be a powerful thing. It's not going to be the easiest thing to set yourself up behind it and then surprise someone with that. But it can be a way to give yourself the freedom and safety to take your time, fire the shots where you want them to go, and know that you're not going to go immediately down just because the E-leader happened to be looking at you or something like that. So I could see that being valuable. And like I said, it's something that when a pencil player sees that they have that option, they're going to pick the time when it's best to run it. And you could probably fit it in if it's something that you want to do in your comp. We're starting to get into some fairly situational territory in this tier here. These are weapons that, again, they do fit pretty one-to-one with other options above them on the tier list. And so it's easy to fit them in. But that's not to say you're going to see them very often. These are going to become rarer and rarer as we go down. So, the Dread Wringer, it's basically what if bucket but zones cheese. That's kind of the argument that I'm seeing for it to be used right now. The main weapon's fine. The main weapon's still just, a bucket. You have to hit your 2 sloshes instead of just 1. Little bit of extra complexity there. Not a huge deal. Has a bit of extra range to compensate for that. So, a little bit more of a midline bucket. Not a big deal, again, that it's got those differences. What really kind of matters is its kit. And the kit that it has, Reef Slider's not great, but you know what it can do? It can cheese a zone. And so if you have a cheesable zone, you've got a bucket player, and they're like, hey, I want to run Dread Wringer. You know what? Let them run Dread Wringer. Let them go and just get you the zone for free every so often, and just play kind of similarly to how you would with a V-Bucket. You'll probably do okay. Rapid Pro Deco is something that you're seeing for certain specific map modes. I I'm not sure exactly entirely what the theory is there, but it's probably something that you're playing fairly similarly to a range blaster, in that it's there to kind of harass and have AoE, that it can contest a pencil in some specific situations when you want to be able to do that. And it's, seen some use recently at top level. So people are generally comfortable saying, yeah, there are a few places where you might want to throw this in there. But it's not something you're seeing on every map mode by any means. It's relatively rare to see. And I haven't personally been able to quite get the hang of exactly when someone's trying to use this. I think it is just specific map modes where it happens to have good angles. But I'd have to look more into that and get some more input from blaster players. S-Blast 91... I see a lot of Range Blaster players kind of going back and forth between Range Blaster and this, depending on what kit they want. The Range Blaster, I would say, is better as a main weapon because of the larger AoE radius that you can consistently get at long range. You have the range of a Range Blaster and the AoE radius of a Range Blaster, both on the S-Blast 91. The problem is you can't get them both at the same time. And that's kind of a problem for a lot of situations where you want to use a blaster. You'd really prefer that the long-range version of the blaster have the big AoE radius on the end so it can reach up and over stuff. This is a weapon that's a lot more difficult to contest, say, a pencil with, if that's something that you want your players doing. It's something that can't poke over ledges quite as well. If the ledge is high up enough, they might just not reach with their big AoE. So, got to be a little careful about that. But they have burst bombs to compensate for that. They also have a booyah bomb. And both of those really are probably better elements of the kit than the range blasters got. Wavebreaker has been fairly weak for a pretty long time. If that booyah bomb is going to get your team in, you're going to get value out of that. Totally worth considering. And I see why people are doing it. V-Dualies. So V-Dualies, I don't think, honestly, that there is much of a reason to use these over Splash. The differences are fairly small, and most of the differences kind of favor the Splash. It's got a little bit more range. It's got the ability to dodge roll. That's really it. You like the burst bomb a lot more on the Splash for its ability to poke at long range and kind of finish off splats that it doesn't have the weapon range to reach. You have the mobility of a shooter, a lightweight shooter, mind you. So, yeah, you can say that the Dualies can, dive in with the rolls, and sometimes that has value. But, like, a short-range shooter with really, really high fire rate, really high paint output, and lightweight movement speed, it's going to move almost as fast as the dodge rolls will, but just like always. It's also not ever going to put you in a position where you're stuck standing still while you fire on the short-range shooter. You can always get out of that, whereas you're going to have some cooldown times on the dodge rolls. So, like, there are ways to use it, and top-level players can absolutely, slay with this thing. It's just, why are you really picking it over the Splash? Differences are minimal enough that it's still a very, very good weapon, but I also don't really know that many reasons that aren't super-duper comp-specific why you would want the one over the other. It seems like a rarity. It's an option you've got. And, if you're able to play one, you're probably able to play the other. So if you do find uses for the one over the other, if you like the range a little better, if there's some reason you actually do really want suction bombs over burst bombs, then you can pick it there. But this is one where I'm like, I've seen it played at top level. It's worked at top level. I just think that you could be doing better by picking the Splash. Next up, these are weapons that I think are fine, but they're not quite going to do the same thing as something in the meta, and so it's going to require that you adjust a little bit with your team comp to let one of these guys in. It can work. You can win with these at top level, absolutely. Just it takes a little bit of engineering to get there. Nautilus is in a really, really awkward spot because it's a very strong weapon. And like I said before, the meta right now favors these midline slayer kind of weapons that shred enemy frontliners as they run at you with Tacticooler. And Nautilus does that really well. Nautilus loves to, for example, sit behind a tent shield or something and be let in. But it also just kind of likes to watch sight lines that are going to be rushed, and if they rush with just a Tacticooler and nothing else, running that into a Nautilus, you're just going to lose all of your Tacticooler buffs, and it's not going to have to do much to be able to do that. So, very strong weapon. The problem is, it's often played as an anchor, and the anchor role is just too stacked right now with the pencil, with the chargers. It's hard to find a spot on your comp to put a Nautilus into. It's also a paint liability. If you're running a Nautilus, you want pretty much everyone else on your team to be able to paint pretty well to make up for it. And that's something that makes it a little bit harder to run in a meta where you're looking at things like squeezers, like range blasters that also don't paint super well. If you're running a Tri Nouveau, that's a little bit less paint, and you might not super want to run that with a Nautilus. So it's harder to fit into a comp, but it's also just really good as a main weapon. And Rain recently got buffed, so it's not going to be useless, and you can totally build a comp around it. It's just you have to build and make some sacrifices to other very, very strong options to be able to get it in there. Carbon Deco. Carbon Deco is very, very good, has been for a long time. It's one of the most deadly weapons in short-range combat at all, but it also has burst bombs, so that if someone gets away from it, they can still try to pick the rest of it up. They can use that burst bomb to chip if they don't have a way in, and they can Zuka if there's somebody that they need to move out of the way to be able to get in. They just have so much kill threat at every range on the map that this thing is absolutely worth putting in, even though it's a paint liability, because if you paint for it, it will slay more than 2 weapons could reasonably be expected to slay otherwise. So, really still a strong option, and roller players will definitely consider it. But the other thing that they're considering right now is the V-Roller. The V-Roller has recently come out as an option that people are realizing is quite playable, even at top level. It just took some, I think it was a top level Japanese player who played it in Area Cup, I want to say, that did perfectly fine with this. The ability to move forward quickly with the curling bomb, but then also secure that space by putting down a big bubbler, makes it so that it kind of circumnavigates one of its biggest problems, which is its paint output. It can't really paint for itself super well in a way that would let it move forward if it didn't have this combination of the curling bomb and the big bubbler. Because a big bubbler is one thing. A big bubbler with a Splat Roller inside it is another. Much more dangerous zone of the map. It can really force the enemy team to back off. Can also, of course, block shots onto the zone. Can also wall things off from getting to the tower. Lots of options there. And it is an AoE weapon. It's something that can hit up over the top of ledges pretty effectively. And really decent, slaying power. So, again, one of those weapons where if you're running this as a slayer, you expect it to be getting a lot of splats. And if it's not getting a lot of splats, it's not getting a lot of value, but it does have the tools that it needs to get those. So definitely something to consider if you are a Carbon player and you've been looking for other options to experiment with. Reflux. I've been playing with a Reflux for a while here. I think one of the big advantages that they gave Reflux recently was that its one-shot is significantly easier to hit. I've been saying for some time that if people start to unlock the potential of hitting Reflux one-shots, that this weapon's going to ascend on the tier list. And the game kind of did that for us by it getting buffed. It's low-key really scary to push a reflux because it kind of feels like you're pushing a charger with a faster charge time as a short range weapon. It's going to outrange you, obviously not from quite the same range as like an E-liter or something, but it is going to outrange something like my little Splattershot, and it can one-shot me, and so I really need to pick my fights against it very carefully. That combined with the fact that if it doesn't fight, it can just paint everything and get missiles very, very quickly, that makes it pretty strong. It's a pretty versatile weapon. I do want to see a little bit more experimentation with it because I think it's got some potential. The Wiper Deco is still fine. The Splatana Wiper, we put where it was because the main weapon can do so many different things. And this one happens to be a missiles option. If you've got a sword who wants to play missiles, you could totally put them on this. It kind of competes a little bit with other support weapons, which is kind of a problem in a meta where the support special is the strongest special in the game. The Tacticooler, that is. So how do you fit this into a comp when you're already trying to devote a lot of your paint, funnel a lot of your paint into something like a pencil or an N-Zap? How do you justify the lack of slaying power that you already are accepting by running a pencil or an N-Zap and then putting this weapon out there, which also kind of lacks in slaying power a bit? Doesn't have quite the same tools to set up for a big, powerful special. Doesn't have as much of a poking option in the sub-weapon. So it's definitely fallen off quite a bit compared to the V Splatana Wiper, even though, again, the hammer is a bit less of a valued option than missiles would be. But if you've got a sword player and you want missiles, I could totally see this working. You just need to, consider what you do with the rest of the comp pretty carefully. Squiffer, I think this main weapon is strong enough that if somebody is really, really good at it, that they can kind of just play in any comp they want to. The kit is fine. It's not ideal. It doesn't have a lethal bomb. It doesn't have a displacement special of any kind or anything like that. But the special does kind of help it keep its positions. It can kind of figure out where people are and use that to hit its shots. It's just super duper duper main weapon reliant. You have to live and breathe Squiffer. You have to, study the blade with this weapon to be able to get that much out of it. And not a lot of people are really willing to do that, considering that there are easier options that are going to get you more value, if anything. C-Jet is going to get you a lot of rain, and it's going to paint a lot. It's going to do very similar things to what the pencils do. And that's kind of the biggest problem. It's like, that thing that it does is fine and valuable, but like the pencils also do it, and you can get cooler that way instead of rain. And there's also a pencil that gets the rain, and so it's going to have a faster kill time. It's going to have longer range, also get the rain, also paint very well. Feels a bit outclassed. If you're running this, you've really got to think like, what else are you running with it? That said, the main weapon's fine. Main weapon's doing just dandy. You just have to think about how you build the rest of the comp around it, and that part is a bit awkward. Okay. Down here are weapons which they're not that bad. They're just a little bit outclassed. They're just struggling a little bit with everything that's above them. Basically, like all of these weapons I'm going to look at and I'm going to be like, this, sure, but like, why not this instead? And they accomplish a lot of those things really well, just not like quite as well as something else. I really think that like anything that's on the screen right now can win games at top level, given the right circumstances, right map mode and, the right comp built around it. Just these ones, you're not going to see do that very often. Like when you do, it's going to be a little bit more of maybe not a surprise, but like, oh, interesting. They ran that there. You're going to ask questions like, why did they run that instead of X, Y, or Z? And it's going to be a little bit more of a thought process. Ballpoint has been struggling specifically because of pencil. If not for pencil being in the game, I think Ballpoint is just absolutely as strong as it always was. But the problem is that weapon not only has longer range, and so it's easy to just kind of pick the ballpoint off because the ballpoint can't walk forward. That was really one of the original reasons that pencil came into the meta, was as a ballpoint counter, because it had the range over the ballpoint and it could poke them out of positions. And also because the pencil just happens to really shut down inkjet pretty well. It's hard to go after a pencil when, if you're using the inkjet, if you're not hitting the very first shot as a direct, it's just going to kite you back. It's just going to back up. It can see your shots coming, and because you have to shoot at it from so far away, it's going to have time to dodge. And so it's going to back up to the point where it has range and it can hit you and then dodge out of the way if it needs to. And the whole time you're trying to move forward towards this pencil, remember, we've got a whole bunch of midline weapons in the meta right now. So you're probably having to fly over the top of a squeezer or a range blaster, that's terrifying, or a bucket, something that also hits inkjets out of the sky really well. And a lot of these weapons combo with the damage of a pencil. Something I don't even think we talked about with the squeezer is that its tap shots combo with pencil shots. You hit one pencil shot, that's 68 damage. Squeezer at long range does 38 damage. Just one pencil shot plus one squeezer shot, and you're dead. That's really scary for an inkjet. That's really hard to justify running an inkjet for. So they kind of just get shot down a lot. It's kind of hard to make them work. They're still a really strong special, but because there's this specific counter in the meta right now, it's hard to get them to run. You can try to go for the VAC play. I have a relatively low opinion of InkVac. I think that even in a lot of the situations where it works, there are other options that could just more reliably clear space. Because an InkVac doesn't force anybody to move. An InkVac just makes it so that somebody else on your team can force them to move or splat them. But, like, why not just put a Booyah Bomb on that spot? Sure, it's not going to last quite as long, but if you need something that's long-lasting, put a crab there and have it just shooting at that spot. I don't see a lot of use cases for that where I don't feel like it's outclassed by something else. But I have seen this used in some specific situations. So, if you have someone who's a Splatling player and they're trying to stick to playing Splatlings and you have some kind of set play you can set up with an InkVac, totally can see that working. And could see that being an option that you'd maybe go to over the Jet Squelcher, depending on who you have playing it. Enperry Dualies, the fact that they have Curling Bomb is not to be underestimated. And Triple Splashdown does do something, but I don't think it does enough. I think if you're going to run Dualies, you're probably just better off going the V Dualies there, the crab version, or something more specialized if that's what you're looking for. But it's fast. It's a Slayer weapon. It has an aggressive Slayer special that might do damage even if you shoot it down. And it has a Curling Bomb to get in. So it's like, not that bad. Just like, I honestly feel like you get more value out of the special of a V-Roller. So it's like paint positivity versus having a special that does more, and neither of the specials do that much. I can't think of like a use case where I'd want it over something else, but I'm also not complaining that much to have one. Like we had a player on my team using them for a while just because they wanted to, and it was like, this feels fine. Like, it's not terrible. I don't think they're getting quite as much value out of a splashdown as they could out of other stuff, but we're still getting stuff done. We're still winning the games that we expect to win. Jet Squelcher, I've talked about InkVac, and that's about all there is to say about this weapon. It is just a paint spam bot that's going to get that and is going to be annoying with its range in the similar way that a Snipewriter will, just less range than a Snipewriter. Again, there's so many backline options where you're only going to try and pick one per team, and the best weapon in the game competes with like all of them. So when I'd ever see this run, I couldn't tell you. But it's something that I also think totally could work if you really needed like a lot of ink facts to make your plan work. The heavies, these are going to play a bit more of that sort of Splatling versus Charger game where they're trying to not contest the pencil, but just play around it and like slay on the sides or something like that. I do think that a Ballpoint or a Nautilus are probably a better choice for trying to do that specific thing if you're trying to use it almost like a midline slayer. But if, for example, you have a Splatling player and you don't really have someone who wants to play 96 Deco and you want a Kraken option, definitely the best alternative in the game to that. I'm not seeing an awful lot of the Wavebreaker version used right now, but that kit, does synergize pretty well with the weapon. And so if you're going to pick up, the heavies, you probably have access to both of them, and I'm probably just going to put them in about the same spot for that reason. Probably using the Deco version more, but I wouldn't, be too surprised if I saw the V version. I'd just be thinking, why? What reasoning do they have for picking that particular kit? Flingza, man, for so long this weapon has been like, it's felt so good and just not been used at all because there are so many other things that you want just a little bit more than you want it. Again, the pencil problem. Like, I told you we were going to go through the list and be like, so the reason that this is outclassed is basically just pencil. The reason that we're not seeing a lot of use out of this is just that pencil's there. Because, like, a lot of stuff is good, but that's what a meta means. It's what you start to evolve toward as a team. And people are definitely evolving away from the Flingza. Missiles are a lot less important than they have been. I think they got nerfed a little while back so that they do less chip damage, which makes them less valuable. And they honestly weren't super valuable even then. They were not the same thing that they were in Splatoon 2 meta. So it's just a little bit worse. But again, it's not that bad, and it's never been that bad. Dynamo Roller has gone up a little bit because of the all-importance of Tacticooler. If you can think of any justification to put in a Dynamo over a Pencil or a Zap or a Tri-Nouveau or a Heavy Edit, by all means go for it. There are a few maps where Dynamo is genuinely a very strong main weapon, where it can hit up over ledges and things like that. And so in those moments, you could definitely flex one in. Just, it's also a weapon that's kind of different than the way that the others play. It's something that you might need to kind of practice up a little bit on your own if you're used to playing other classes of weapon. It's still got some weird hitbox jank to it, so it's not the easiest thing to run. And I don't have it up in the meta-defining tier because I do genuinely think those four are the options you're going to see at top level much more often than you're going to see this. But it's an alternative. It has Tacticooler, and therefore, if you can come up with a reason why you like that main weapon better than you like the kits of the others, go for it. Sorella Brella feels like it's very close to being good. I genuinely think that if Inkjet were just stronger in the meta right now, we'd be seeing a lot of this thing. One thing that someone noted recently to me is that in duos, you actually see a lot of Brellas for countering Pencil, for blocking Pencil shots and being able to walk toward it. And that's an interesting idea, like that this can have some potential to counter the meta. The problem is that it comes with an Inkjet, and Inkjet's just not doing super hot right now, for the reasons we discussed earlier. In an environment with fewer players, there's less to worry about in terms of, oh, there might just be a random range blaster underneath me. you probably know where everybody is at that point, and you're kind of just pressuring the pencil to hit their shots. But it needs just a little bit of something. A meta shift would probably be enough. A buff would probably be enough. If it gets both, I could see it becoming meta. But right now, it's not quite there yet. Rapid, again, I need to see more value out of InkVac. You know, it's got another kit that's doing okay on very specific maps. If VAC is found to be more impactful in some circumstance, if it's something that people want to run on cooler comps, then you could totally run with this and make it work. There are other options that are going to get your VAC quicker, though. So it needs to be like, I need the VAC and I also need the AoE, and they both need to be on this weapon, which feels like a really rare situation, especially given how many AoE options you have and how many players are willing to run those weapons. Forge Pro has long been the weapon that's like good enough that it can win, but also why would you run it? It's like, oh, it's one of the lowest high tiers or highest low tiers, or it's a really awkward spot because nothing that it has is particularly bad except maybe the ink efficiency. But when you put this up against a squeezer, there's just not that much contest. It's really hard for this weapon to win against the squeezer. The Zuka is going to potentially just shred its Booyah armor. Got a little bit less range. It does slightly higher damage than a squeezer tap shot, but I don't think that gets it over a lot of thresholds for comboing with things. I guess if you wanted to try and combo with like burst bomb directs or the charge slashes off Splatana Wiper or something like that, then, you know, it doing 42 damage instead of the 38 damage of the squeezer matters. But I think that's a lot less of a big deal than just being able to get up over 35. Than just being able to combo, say, with a Snipewriter shot. That's a lot more common of a source of damage. So that's not that much of an advantage for it. It's just not a lot going for it, considering it's got almost an identical kill time to the squeezer, which has longer range. So on an ideal team, you probably just run the squeezer instead. But if someone's really not willing to run that and you pass up on a lot of other options and end up down here, it's something you could probably win with. So, I'm not ruling it out. There's just a lot of options above it. Splattershot Nouveau, we talked about Inkjet, and Inkjet is about all this little guy's got. And it's still going to be able to get a bunch of those Inkjets, and as soon as Inkjets come back into the meta, we're going to see these things, but for now, it's just kind of weak for that reason, that it's going to run into a lot of weapons that specifically counter it. Bamboo. Bamboo's honestly great. Like, it got a nice points for special buff that it's actually pretty significant for it. It's going to get more whales. It's a charger. The pencil is the best weapon in the game. When do you run a bamboo over a pencil? You've got to, swap your put your backline weapon on this bamboo, and then put some other frontliner on some kind of cooler weapon, and you're doing that to get less range and a whale. For what reason? You've got to really be cooking on the theory crafting side to find a point to do this over just going with your charger being on a pencil. Rapid Deco. We've talked about the Inkjet problem. There's also a lot of AoE weapons that are competing with it now. Ones that may be more lethal for one reason or another. Or can benefit more from cooler would be another reason. It's kind of hard to run this and a pencil at the same time because it's a slow-moving, more anchor-oriented weapon. So you'd want to be running this with some kind of frontline weapon that's going to have the cooler. So it's a little bit difficult to run these days. I would say that it's not one of those great inkjet options anymore, that you're probably looking at something else over it, even if you want an inkjet. But again, it's not a bad weapon at all, never has been, and I don't think it will be. It's just, its kit's in a rough spot right now. Big Bubbler. We're talking about the Mini and we're talking about the Junior. I think the big issue with Big Bubbler right now is that with Tacticooler being in the meta, it's hard to run another special that's not going to be used aggressively. The Splat Roller kind of gets away with this simply because it's using the Big Bubbler more aggressively than these guys will. These are more supports. And since you're already running a support that's getting a support special by running a Tacticooler weapon, how do you fit these into a comp? You can do it, it's just, it can get really passive if you're not super careful about how you do it, and it's definitely not something we're seeing in the meta very much. Tetra Dualies. These, in theory, benefit a lot from the Tacticooler, in that they're trying to kind of dive in and attack things. I think part of the problem might just be that running in headlong is getting stopped really hard by the midline Slayer types. It's not a very fast kill time, and that's kind of something that you want if you're going to try and rush down something like a Squeezer or a Range Blaster. So I think that's what's difficult about them, that a lot of the time they're just going to be getting splatted, and their opponents are going to be racking up massive KAs from just splatting them over and over again as they try to run at you. They do have potential zones cheese options, but it's not going to paint for the Reef Slider very often. If that's what you're trying to play it for, you're probably trying to play another option, like maybe a Dread Wringer. So they've fallen off quite a bit. I have not seen them in a good long while at top level. So not in the best spot right now, it seems. Custom Dualie Squelchers. The problem with the Dualie Squelchers right now, it's that they don't do damage fast enough. It's less valuable to stall right now and do damage slowly but kite people because Cooler is in the meta. Why worry like, oh wait, I might need to fight this guy. Do I need to fight this guy? When you could just be like, let's just fight this guy, and if we die, it doesn't matter because we just respawn very quickly. Keeping someone's attention for a long amount of time isn't so much important if the way you're keeping their attention is just by running at them, by initiating a fight again. And these don't fight very quickly. They're more about moving up slowly and making tactical plays, and that's not what Cooler meta is all about. Cooler meta is about hitting them hard and hitting them fast repeatedly. And this weapon doesn't want to hit anybody. It wants to sit on the corner and let you feed into it. Why would you run at this thing and feed into it when you could just run at its teammates and try to kill them? You're not providing enough of a threat to be dealt with a lot of the time. The special that you're farming for, like, it's not like they have to go after you to get rid of the enemy team's Cooler or something. They've got chumps. And chumps are great for setting up, macro level tactical plays. They paint an awful lot. It's something that can be kind of nice on zones to have. And they give you beacon support. But again, Tacticooler, you basically have your teammates for beacons, because by the time you go down, there's probably someone on your team you can safely jump to in the next 5 seconds or so that is just going to be a safe jump because that whole process has been sped up so much. So the need to replace a sub-weapon on your team for a beacon has drastically diminished. I just don't think that this is going to be super high value in most cases. We're still seeing some use of it out of Japan specifically, but we're not really seeing it get picked up. We're not seeing it get implemented pretty much anywhere else than on, like, I think it's a particular team that runs it in that way, and maybe a few copycats or something, but it hasn't been like meta-defining or anything like that from what I know of it. This blaster might be a little bit too high, I'll be honest. I like this one better than the vanilla blaster. because I think that its special does more for it. Um, I think it's a lot more of a sure thing to hit your shot on someone who's rushing into the bubble of a Splat Roller than it is to rush into the bubble of a V Blaster. The V Blaster gets one shot, and it should really probably be a direct, and if it's not a direct, then you're dead. The Roller, if you miss that shot in the range of a big bubbler, I mean, you just kind of messed up there. It's understandable to miss the direct, less so to miss the roller flick, the horizontal flick. Um, so I don't really like the big bubbler for it, and I think that having an aggressive special in the splashdown's at least a little bit better. That there are some creative ways you can use the fist explosions to make it a little bit safer and, put out enough of a threat that your opponents have to back off instead of just shooting you down from it. The point sensor is really helpful because it can help you track people around corners. We see that with the X-Blow, which I guess we're about to talk about soon. How being able to see where you need to put your AoE to hit someone makes it so that your shots are more sure to land. So even though you don't really have a lethal bomb to poke with, which is a big disadvantage of the weapon, and probably one of the reasons that I kind of want to put it a little bit lower thinking about it, you are still able to enable your main weapon and make it so that whatever is in your weapon range is really threatened. Just right now, having the extra range on the Range Blaster or the S-Blast, I think is more important to be able to contest a lot of the options, which are going to be longer range. Like a lot of the things you're going to be fighting are going to be like buckets, squeezers. If you can get in on the Snipewriter, you're going to be looking for picks on that, the Stamper, and the lower range of that blaster, the V Blaster, kind of disincentivizes you from using it. Blob Deco is a Kraken farmer. It is the fastest Kraken that you can get because it just paints so fast for it. So if you just really need Kraken cheese very, very reliably and very fast, and you need like a lot of paint positivity on the weapon that's getting it, there's an argument. Bloblobber is very inconsistent in terms of DPS. It's pretty hard to actually get picks with against someone who's mechanically not going to respect the right zones that it controls and play around it well. Someone who recognizes what the weapon's weaknesses are. I don't think that this weapon can be played super aggressively like I think it would have to be in order to be as valuable. The Kraken, though, it's going to be something that you get very often, and it's something that if your team can use that like they can in Clan Blitz, might be worth sometimes. X-Blow, same problem we've had with like a lot of the anchors here. It's really hard to play this into something like a charger. Something that's going to one-shot you when you can't one-shot it back. You can hit it from places that it can't hit you, but then it just fires a single line, backs up, and it's out of range by the time the second shot comes in, and now, well, you didn't pick it. It knows where you are. Its teammates know where you are. Did you do enough with that? Because meanwhile, it was getting a Tacticooler ready, even if it wasn't able to hit anything, and now its teammates are stronger. All you got out of that was a rain. And granted, that's more helpful now than it used to be, but I just don't really see it getting used, even though it's right on the cusp of being able to be viable if, there's a meta shift or something. Inkbrush recently got a movement buff. I saw, I think, a video of the difference, like how fast you move from one patch to the other, and it's very slight. It doesn't seem like it's going to have a ton of impact. Obviously, this is a very fast game, and even a little bit of a movement goes a long way, but I think it kind of needed a lot instead of a little to be able to see more use than it has recently. So we're not going to see a lot of brushes anytime soon. There are still some people who are, one tricks of it that will continue to play it wherever they can. And if it pops up every now and then, I'm not like super duper surprised, but it's definitely more of you're one tricking brushes and that's why you're playing this than because it brings that much more value to than other stuff above it. It's really hard to play into longer ranged weapons. People's aim, it's only getting better, and being able to aim well enough to hit this thing on the move makes it very difficult for it to approach you. The maps also just do not help this weapon at all. It needs corners to run into and hide in, and doesn't have a lot of those. So it's struggling a little bit in general. The Octo brushes, they have a little bit more range to compensate, and the AoE that comes from that longer range can also compensate quite a bit. I think there are people who can, at top level, play Octobrush pretty consistently, and they'll kind of go back and forth between the two kits. But those, again, seem to me like people who are one-tricking the brush more than people who are picking the, on paper best weapon for the job. Okay, getting down to the weapons that I genuinely don't think we will see win very many games at top level, and for good reason. It took us a while to get here. We've gone through a lot of the weapons available. Like, they barely fit on screen, all of these guys. I think all of these can win at top level. Will they very often? Not all of them. Will people even pick all of them? Not very often. But I think all of them definitely have a lot of potential. I think you get this low, and we're starting to talk about weapons that have some pretty significant weaknesses, or are so outclassed that it's just like, man, why are you not picking other options? So, V-Tent, like I've said, low opinion of VAC right now, and the Sorella tent has Zuka. So, it feels to me like you'd have to have a really specific game plan ready to really want to use the VAC version. The VAC version, was always like mid to low tier for a long time. And I think it's kind of still there. It just doesn't have a lot of aggressive potential. It doesn't have much that's going to force you to look at it. And that's what it needs to do. I talked a little bit about V-Blaster earlier. I don't think it synergizes super well with the bubble. It's really nice that it's got a bomb, but the bomb is a lot less likely to get splats for you because it's an auto bomb, because it's manipulatable. And having the extra vision that you get from the point sensor on the other kit, I think is more valuable for being able to hit your shots than the auto bomb walking vaguely in a particular direction to alert you that maybe someone's over there. You're also just not going to get that special very often, so that's a little bit less an important part of the kit. V Squelchers, same problem as custom Squelchers, except now it's got a bomb that's more expensive ink-wise. Even though it's a better bomb on paper, it's something where the beacon that you put down, you're going to put down when you're safe, and you're going to get all of that ink back before you have to do anything with your ink. This is a weapon, remember, that uses jump tech, which is very ink intensive, and you want to have as full of an ink tank as you can when you start having to fight, so that you can use that jump tech for as long as possible before you have to retreat and disengage. And throwing a splat bomb just doesn't play into that playstyle very well, because it just drains your whole ink tank, and now you can't do the thing that you want to do in combat. Also, Wavebreaker is just a weaker special than most of the specials in the game right now. It's not very high value, so if you're going to run Squelchers, I'd probably recommend the custom kit over this. And I still wouldn't recommend running either of them, mostly for reasons we've already talked about. Zap 89, we talk about this every time, it seems like. It's going to be a strong weapon as soon as Super Chumps are meta. Once we really want Super Chumps, one of the best options in the game right there. But we don't really want those. They're fine. They're not like a kit killer 100%. They do have some impact. They paint a lot more than they used to. They're still on the bottom half, I'd say, of specials. And considering that your Zap could instead be getting you a Tacticooler, running a support weapon just to get this special when you already have a support weapon on a meta team comp that's going to be getting you one of the best specials in the game, it's hard to justify losing out on the slaying power you could get by running something up here when all you're getting for it is a zap and an auto bomb. Glooga Dualies, I've talked about this a lot before, and my opinion hasn't changed. Fire rate is the main problem. Buff the fire rate instantly, much more powerful weapon, something you want to consider because that'll buff the paint output and that'll buff the shot volatility, I guess. The higher the fire rate, the less it matters that you miss a single shot. This thing has such a slow fire rate that missing a single shot feels really bad. So very high skill ceiling weapon, and you can push them a lot higher the better you can aim. But I still don't think that you tend to see them so high that it'd be worth really getting cracked at aiming them to unlock all of that. Light Tetra Dualies. They're just better Zipcaster options right now. We talked about how the Dark Tetras running in is really hard because you got so many midline weapons you have to contend with. And you've got the same problem here. But this one doesn't have zones cheese. And this one is outclassed for its Zipcaster role by something like the Splatana Stamper, which is going to be the much more common Zipcaster option. I'd even probably prefer to take an Octobrush at this point over the Dualies, because at least the Octobrush has some AoE. Hydra, this is a meta that's very dependent on speed, on running forward at the enemy team and taking fights quickly. So even if you have another cooler option, Hydra isn't super well positioned to take advantage of that special. If you're going to run a Hydra, it's almost like you want to run like a coolerless comp, or just expect to be able to splat a lot of people as they run at you. But that's really dangerous because all it takes is like a Zuka to clear you out of position, and now their rush is still coming at you. It's a weapon that can win a 1v3 if it gets into the right position, the opponents don't know where it is, and it can absolutely shred through cooler users, but its team is still going to have trouble with those cooler users respawning soon, and it's not going to be able to move up as quickly with them, and so they're going to have to win more fights. And it just feels like you need to splat like twice as many people on the Hydra as splat your teammates just to be able to stay even with the Tacticooler team if you're not running it yourself. So I just think the meta is always going to demand speed, and the more it demands speed, the more the Hydra is going to fall behind. The more you're able to sit back and play defense, the better the Hydra is going to do. And if you play with a Hydra, what you're going to want to do is find ways to cheese out advantages and get leads so that the Hydra can then hold those leads. And that's kind of how you need to play it. Tri-stringers. We've talked about these problems with anchors multiple times before. It's just other anchors that you're trying to use over these. The paint output is not super great on these. They could really probably use a buff on how much they put down on the ground. And the specials that they get are not super desirable on either kit. Super Chumps or Killer Whale, both of them aren't useless. Both of them aren't the worst in the game, but neither of them are so desirable that you'd want them over having a cooler, having strikes, having rain. I don't even know if I would want one of them over Inkjet. So there's a lot else that you could be having on that anchor position. And given the aim intensiveness of them for hitting one-shots, given the inconsistent ability to splat, given how little they do off of just the explosions of the arrows, how much you would need your team to combo with them, it can work in that there are a lot of weapons that can combo with that damage well, but you need to be very coordinated to pull it off. And you're just going to get more value out of other things, I think, most of the time. Splattershot Pro, it's not going to get a lot of crabs. It's going to, like we said, get outranged by the squeezer. It's not got the greatest ink efficiency. Basically, every part of this kit you can get better from something else. If there comes a time where we really need our line markers, we might still not be getting them from this weapon, but I mean, it's going to be better, at least. Mini Splatling, I've always thought it was like a little bit of a mismatch. Like, Hammer's not bad, Mini's not bad. Put them together, I don't know why you'd want to run that in particular. With the Splatana Wiper, this is a weapon that's comfortable getting up close to someone to be able to activate the hammer and get on top of them, because with the main weapon, you can just melee them if they get too close. With the Mini, you might catch it without its charge, and then it's in a lot of trouble. So there's a gap between it swimming into position to use its special and actually using it that creates a little bit of a mismatch. Burst Bomb is great, Mini is great. Put those two together on another special, and you could totally have a great weapon here, but I just don't think that any of the things it's bringing to the table are best seen on this kit. Vanilla Blob is kind of just a paint bot, not doing an awful lot to help the team in terms of fights. It can maybe hold enemy players back, but it's not going to actually stop them by splatting them. Once someone's running at this thing with a Tacticooler, like, they can dodge the blobs a lot easier. It just seems really hard to use this thing, given that all you're getting from all of the paint output is something like a rain. I think there's more of a specialized purpose for the Blob Deco in that it gets Kraken, and that's usable for Kraken cheese. I don't see what this one has going for it. Splat Brella, the strikes are just a little bit too passive and not super worth spending all of that time painting for. The Brella itself isn't doing a ton. Again, I think it's not a bad option, like, into something like a Snipewriter for blocking those particular shots before it's able to get away, or, you know, shield a teammate or something. But the thing with the Brella, again, is that you need to establish some kind of threat that makes them have to deal with you. And there's not that much of a threat from this weapon. It's just a fairly mediocre fighting weapon, especially with weapons that have longer range or AoE that help it ignore the shield. So I think it kind of gets bullied a little bit too much to see use as a midline fighter in the way that these top tier weapons are. And the special that it's getting isn't strong enough to be worth splashing it for that exact purpose. Like, why not just run a bucket? Bucket's probably going to do more for you, be more mobile, and get strikes and have a lethal bomb and all this nice stuff. So I don't see much of a reason to use it. It's not like super duper terrible and useless. This Slosher, it's something you can flex to if you have this, but I don't see a reason for most people ever to do that. Like, you could, I guess, put it up here if there were a map mode basis where you actually wanted to use this thing, but I don't know one of those that exists. Like, I have not seen this see very much use at all at top level. The other Tacticooler option, I guess, is the Dapples. Dapples as a main weapon are very weak and will need a significant buff, I think, to see that much use at top level. We've seen some use specifically in top level Japanese play in, I think, Rainmaker, for basically their ability to teleport, for just being too fast to effectively predict and track with your aim. But that depends on being able to position very close to the enemy team. Like we've mentioned, there are a lot of weapons that are midline slayers that will hit this way before it can ever get close. There's also a bunch of, paint support weapons that are in the meta right now that are going to find it before it gets close enough. So it feels really hard for any of these weapons to get in, and you're not getting any tools to get in on the Tacticooler kit, so the other Tacticooler options are definitely preferred. Well, except for the H3, but we'll get to this poor sap later. The other Dapple Dualies get Reef Slider. There are better options to get Reef Slider quickly if you're looking for zones cheese that don't involve sacrificing all of the weapon's range to be able to get it. The torpedo is marginally better for being able to poke and fight than the other dapples, and that's one thing that puts this a little bit ahead, but it's never been enough for people to really want to use them. Opening Gambit makes this weapon better, doesn't make it good. Having so many shots that you need to fire before someone's splatted, and not having something like an inkjet to provide it with that offensive boost that it needs, only having the whale. Like, I bet there are a bunch of weapons that could out DPS this thing while the whale is on them and it's shooting at them. I'm not sure, I'd have to confirm that, but like, it seems like a weapon that's like that, where you could probably just stand in the whale and tank the whale and kill this thing and at least trade, because it's so slow to do damage. So yeah, you're going to be a constant like point sensor bot, but you can throw point sensors on this thing, and you can throw point sensors on this thing. You can even throw point sensors on this thing if you want to, or this thing. And I think you get a lot more value out of the rest of the kits there than you're going to get from a little bit of paint and just a whole bunch of whale spam. Because honestly, at this point you have to think, why are we running a support that's only getting whales when we could run a support that's going to get consistent coolers instead? Like, isn't the paint that this is putting down actually inhibiting us because it's making it so that fewer fights that we take are being taken with cooler? Like, at least something like a Zuka or a Crab is actually going to help us win those fights more effectively than the whale is. So if that's all that it's bringing to the table, like, that might actually be an active detriment. Like, it might be less than the sum of its parts. Next up, Sploosh. Sploosh can kind of get in there and do things if it is allowed to get in there. If it gets pre-fired, it's dead. And there are a lot of things that can pre-fire it. It depends heavily on like the squeezer missing some shots because it's at long range and it has to track really hard, or the range blaster not knowing exactly where it is around the corner or something to be able to get into position. Hammer is definitely not bad, but this thing can get into position with the same kind of alacrity as the Sploosh can. It's obviously not quite as fast as the Sploosh is. The Sploosh is the fastest swimming weapon in the game, and it paints extremely well, much better than the Wiper does. But the Wiper puts down enough paint for it to swim through a whole line right away, and that can sometimes be more valuable than having to paint swim like you do with the Sploosh. So if you're considering running a Sploosh, I would recommend considering a Wiper instead, because the lack of range here really, really hurts it, especially the lack of a poking tool, since you're primarily going to be using the curling bomb for movement. You can use it to try and poke, but it's going to be a lot less effective, especially up over ledges, compared to the torpedo. So I think it's probably just a bit outclassed. Inkbrush Nouveau, very similar issue. It's a small zippy weapon that has a hammer and just doesn't have enough range, I think, to contend, and not enough of a way to poke away the weapons that have better range than it. Aerospray, you're using this for slider cheese, and you're sacrificing a lot of fighting power to run it over the Dread Wringer. Granted, you're going to have that slider cheese a little bit more often, but you're probably not going to have it that much more often than you need it. And what you're giving up in terms of the range of the weapon, the consistency of hitting the shots, the AoE potential of the weapon is so much that I just wouldn't ever think it's worth it in most cases, unless you're like super paint negative and need this thing to specifically be doing that to compensate for other parts of a comp that you've built around this thing being the main painter. And I wouldn't even recommend doing that on a comp, because that puts a lot of pressure on this thing to stay alive. And aerosprays are tissue paper. You go through them very quickly. It's very easy to run down unless they are able to get right directly on top of you to the point where it actually negates their aim RNG. Probably just going to get shredded by anything with marginally longer range than it. This weapon is one of the better, like, pure slider cheese options in that it can kind of just keep itself safe with the wall and paint very, very quickly with the main weapon until it gets the slider. So again, if all you care about is getting a lot of sliders, this is your weapon probably, but that's not a thing that's strong enough. Like, you need to have the slider cheese, but have the weapon be functional in the meanwhile. At least this thing gets a fizzy bomb. This, you really just kind of need to focus on either getting one-shots or painting. And if you're going to be trying to play it for constant slider cheese, you're just going to die a lot. And yeah, you'll get the slider cheese, but it'll be kind of like your team is fighting a 4v3 over a partially painted zone the whole time. V-Carbon, I had to think a lot about, and I put it up slightly higher, based purely pretty much on the fact that one time Red Shell wrote that there is a use case for V-Carbon over Octobrush. Now, we've already established that I don't think there's even that much use for Octobrush. Red Shell is able to make it happen. I honestly couldn't, off the top of my head, aside from Chara, I guess, who isn't playing it currently, and that's why I don't count him, I couldn't tell you the name of another active Octobrush player than Red Shell. So there's a very small sample size of people who are even interested in considering that option. And at top level, that's like almost no one. I've found like a tournament VOD where a Carbon Deco player decided to use V-Carbon once because their team wanted a Zipcaster. But like, when someone in competitive play says Carbon, they mean this Carbon. They do not ever mean this one. If they're talking about this one, they will call it V-Carbon, vanilla Carbon. The adjective goes on this one, even though it was the first weapon in the game that was called the Carbon Roller. This one's the Carbon. Whenever anyone says that when they're filling it into a comp, this is the one that you are meant to assume they mean. Because this one cannot poke an opponent who just barely skittered away them with a burst bomb to finish the splat. And this weapon also needs to actually dive in with the Zipcaster to get on top of faraway targets, whereas this one can just nuke them from orbit with a Trizooka. This one has control over the close range, the mid-range, and the long range, whereas this one has control over the short range, basically nothing but an auto bomb so that it can see what's in the mid-range, and a very, very risky all-in option at the long range. So you just pick this one instead. There's not much of a reason. There's so many other Zipcaster options that I think are just better. The Stamper comes immediately to mind because it's so popular. Probably not this one. It's fun, but like Stamper's probably just going to be better. L3D, it feels like it almost works as a Slayer option, but this gets the same special and it's more mobile. Slightly better combo tool with its sub-weapon, but the main weapon being burst fire, it's always going to be a disadvantage because it's slower to fire. You can't one-shot with just a single burst. You have to like hit a single burst and then a burst bomb or something like that, which is a lot of ink to expend. Either that or firing a second shot, which takes a long time. And if you hit the first shot, you still need to fire the next two before you're going to be able to move again. So a shooter that's fully auto is just going to be better than this. They try to compensate by giving it slightly better range. But you know what else has better range and is much more fully auto? It's the Squeezer. Yeah, you have to mash this thing, but mashing it doesn't lock you into one of those shots for anywhere near as long. And you do have a rapid fire mode if you need to just hold down the button. So I don't ever see a reason to run this. If you want a hammer, you can probably go for something like this. But you often don't want a hammer either. Vanilla L3, why not Splash? Yes, you've got a little bit of extra range, but the Splash gets that from the Burst Bomb. And the Splash is a lot more maneuverable. Splash is going to paint just as fast for the Crab. Curling Bomb doesn't synergize super well with this thing. Why not Splash? H3. This is probably my opinion of the weakest cooler weapon. I think it's kind of close between it and the Dapples, but It's able to play a little bit more passively just as a part of its main weapons playstyle, which is nice for it, because that lets it just farm for cooler. And it's nice being able to mark people to, send its minions, its Tacticooler teammates off to go and get. But it's not going to have the same range as the pencil, so it's still going to get bullied by a pencil. It doesn't really have much of a way of poking the pencil either. So it just kind of loses that matchup. It doesn't have quite the same kill time as something like a heavy edit will. It's still fairly fast, but the fire rate on this thing is just insane. It doesn't really want to get caught up in a short range fight against the other cooler options. So it's just like a really, really aim dependent weapon, one that's pretty difficult to reliably defend with. You can't just like throw a lethal bomb out in front of you. You have to hit your like 3-shot to rapidly splat someone. And it doesn't feel great in a fast-paced game where it's going to move up very slowly because of the way that it paints for itself. H3D, very similar problem in that it's just a very slow weapon. It's one that really wants to not take a lot of risks because it can't paint for itself super well, so it needs to not get stuck in something. It wants to use its range, but it's not got that much more range than a lot of important options in the game, and all it's providing otherwise is defensive utility, which is not what gets you in. It's not what starts a cooler push. Makes it really hard to use. So I think this is solidly worse than the Tacticooler version, but they're both not great. The big swigs are paint bots, and right now we've got this, which is a paint bot, and this, which is a paint bot, and this, which is a paint bot. So if you want paint bots, you're probably farming different specials than what these guys are giving you. Even this, you're, at least missiles is going to give you a little bit more than something like a vac. Inkstorm's not bad, but you got to give more than Inkstorm as a main weapon, and so we're probably not going to be seeing a lot of these. This you can kind of run for zones cheese, but it's kind of hard to run that against a bunch of sliders because sliders are going to be a more common option for trying to cheese the zone. So I imagine that if that's something you're trying to do, cheese the zone, you probably go for a slider instead. I haven't seen exactly how those interact before, but that might be what kind of killed these off. Or it might just be that the main weapon is weak enough in a fight that people aren't really interested in running it. Gold Dynamo. I said that, this Dynamo is feeling about the best that it's ever felt, and that's primarily because of Tacticooler pulling it up a little bit. This one doesn't have quite the same step ladder to stand on. It only has super chumps, and yes, it has a nice lethal bomb. And yes, it kind of works well with it, but it's just kind of slow. And you have to take very particular positions on very particular maps to get the maximum value out of something like a Dynamo. Slow generally just doesn't tend to do well in competitive video games, and I think that this is no exception here. Then we have the V-Rapid, which is a very awkward weapon that's just slow in every way. Its main weapon is relatively slow. Its sub-weapon doesn't do anything to let it paint its feet quickly. It doesn't give it any kind of poking options to get kills faster. And then its special is slow and vulnerable and exposed where it has to stand still a lot. It's an AoE option, and AoE options are great, but there are so many of those that are seeing more use right now that it's not that much of a reason to run it at this point, and I wouldn't recommend it to basically anyone. If you're going to run one of the rapids, run this one so you can combo with the torpedo and potentially actually have a chance at splatting someone at short range. Okay, now we just get to the point where it's like, there are strengths, sure, but there are so many better options that if you're going for this, I just don't understand. I don't know why you would want to run one of these over the many other things you have in the game that do a lot of those things better. So first of all, the Paintbrush Nouveau for missile spam. As we'll see below, I think the Paintbrush is one of the weakest main weapons in the entire game. I think it's just entirely too slow. And that, yes, it has AoE, but that AoE has a better source with longer range and a better fire rate from elsewhere. And that AoE does not save it being slow. Its mobility option, that you get from being a brush, being severely nerfed by, again, being slow. And the extra paint that you're putting down for it is not making up for it. So main weapon, really, really holding it back. If you want missiles, you can get it on other main weapons that are just better. And so I just don't see a reason ever to want to use this. S-Blast 92. You have a version of this that has Burst Bomb Booyah. Why would you choose Sprinkler Reef Slider? Why do you want that? Those are two of the strongest pieces of kit in the game. Two of the weakest pieces of kit in the game. And if you're trying to use this to cheese zones like you can with Reef Slider, why are you doing it on one of the single weapons that paints the worst? It's a blaster. You're not going to get that very often. So, sure, you can use it kind of aggressively, but what you could also do is get a splat by hitting someone once, watching them run away, hitting them with a burst bomb, and then using a Booyah Bomb to get your team in now that you have a numbers advantage, and use, continuation off the Booyah Bomb. This is not the kind of thought that you're having with this. With this weapon, you're thinking, okay, so when I die, will it have been worth it? C Junior is a very common weapon played by newer players because so much of the kit plays itself. You just paint an awful lot, and that's valuable. You throw torpedoes, and those will lock onto people for you, and you don't have to aim them particularly well to be able to get value out of those. And then the Wave Breaker is just going to send out waves, and as long as you throw it vaguely near the fight, that's going to get some value for you. The problem is that all of those things get countered pretty well or dealt with by other weapons higher up, and the torpedoes become less and less useful as you get higher and higher up because people shoot them down. So you have to do things like roll them to get full damage, and this doesn't really combo with rolling a torpedo in the way that some of the other weapons that we put higher do. And Wavebreaker becomes one of the weaker weapons in the game because people just have the awareness to jump over the waves and shred the thing whenever they get the chance to. And you don't have the weapon range to try and push in and capitalize off that super duper well when they try to shoot the thing. A lot of the time they can just turn and shoot you before you can reach them. So very, very short range in this meta that's dominated by these kinds of weapons here. It's hard to run. And so these are not in a great place right now. Kraken Roller is it's actually pretty close to being a functional kit in the sense that it would just need one more thing that synergizes and it might work. The thing about this kit that puts it up so much higher than something that is the same main weapon as it is that it has a sub and a special that give it stuff that the main weapon doesn't already have. The sub gives it a lot more mobility. It lets it move in faster. The special makes it so that when it moves in fast, it gets to stay there. So this thing can actually take space. It can actually force people out of the way. Whereas with this guy, the problem is that your sub-weapon doesn't get you in unless you're jumping behind enemy lines. If they're missing a beacon like that, then they're probably not a top-level team. Top-level teams are either destroying those beacons immediately as soon as they find them, or they're deciding that they can ignore them and making that decision correctly. It's very hard to use beacons in this particular game because the levels are so linear, and once you've swept through an area, you've probably cleared it of all of the beacons as you moved. So it's rare that you are able to use the beacons in a way that gets you into positions you couldn't get to otherwise. The role of beacons is largely being played by Tacticooler right now because your teammates just become beacons when you spawn in so quickly, and the enemy team hasn't had a chance to displace all of them. So there's probably someone far enough back that you can jump into them unless your team is really screwed up. So those are a lot less valuable right now. And it gets Kraken, which, oh hey, Kraken cheese, that's a thing. But this is one of the slowest weapons in the game at building Kraken. I think the slowest. I'm thinking there are unless I'm forgetting something really drastic, because you can get it really fast in the Blob Deco, you can get it pretty fast in the 96, you can get it faster on the Heavy. So slowest Kraken option, so least reliable. You're going to die a lot more often using this thing because it's so short range and needs to get it right up next to people to be able to hit them, which often means sneaking in, going behind enemy lines, higher risk kinds of moves. So if you're relying on that Kraken cheese to happen at the right time, less likely to happen. Yes, it's nice to have the panic option for, oh, I got in too deep and now I can't get out super well, or I just confirmed a splat, but someone's coming to try and trade me and I need to avoid that, so I pop the Kraken to get out of that. But most that's ever going to get you is one clean splat. And with a weapon like this, where you're such a paint liability to your team, you really want to be giving more value. You want to be getting a lot of fast multi-splats. And to do that, you're going to need to be able to move in, but then set up. Whereas the Kraken, it's not going to control space. A big bubbler that a roller is inside means you can't really go through that area. You kind of have to get around it if the area is big enough to do that, or you need to just kind of deal with the bubble and slowly shred it down, and that wastes a lot of time. The Kraken, as long as you can get around it, you can go wherever you want, because the range that Kraken controls is relatively small, and all it can really do is chase one person. It can't lock down a whole choke point. So if it had the ability to control an area better, if it had the ability to get in better to be able to use the Kraken, either one of those things would make this a much better option. But because it lacks those things, you're much better off using one of the other rollers, one of the many other rollers. 96 Gal is a relatively slow, kind of difficult to defend midline shooter. Like, yes, midline shooters are doing decently well right now, but this is a very slow moving one that only gets Inkvac, which isn't super high impact compared to the other things. You know, you can compare that to getting Azuka, to getting the Kraken cheese set up. So not being able to get something that's quite as valuable, I think, sinks it down pretty low. And the sub weapon is just not doing enough for it. You really want to be able to poke or defend yourself or something with that sub weapon. Not having that means you're just looking at a really unreliable weapon, aim-wise, that gets a pretty mediocre special. Not a lot of a reason to use it. The arrow spray, I mean, it paints a lot and it gets a lot of booyah bombs, but that is not how you win games of Splatoon. You need more than that. You need to not crumple like a piece of tissue paper when someone pushes you, and that is what this weapon does. It does not have a sub-weapon it can use to keep people off it. It really just depends on either getting super duper close or being left to its own devices to be able to paint. And if you give up space, the only area you have to paint is your base, and you only have paint you can put down in your base for so long before you run out of space and you need someone to create more space for you to push in and paint over enemy ink to get more of those booyah bombs. Well, your weapon isn't helping to secure that space very much. All it can do is start the push. It can't really participate in it very well. A lot of the other booyah weapons that we see, something like the Machine, something like the S-Blast, they can run forward and fight with their own booyah bombs, or at least in the aftermath of the booyah bomb. But this thing just kind of wants to get another booyah bomb again, which is going to take it out of play for a long time. So, very much just like a weapon for people who think that it's good in Turf War, when in fact it's like good in like low-level solo queue Turf War, but you probably wouldn't even want to run it at top level. The GooTubers are very awkward. They're definitely like the worst chargers. And this is a game where we have many, many other chargers that lots of people like running. This one is the better kit because it's got torpedo and missiles. This one I don't think will ever be particularly great because hammer on a GooTuber doesn't make a lot of sense. It does still want to use its range, as little of it as it has compared to the other chargers. It needs like a faster charge time, or it needs better range or something, I think, if this thing is ever going to be particularly viable, because the charge hold gimmick is just not doing enough for it. I think this is a weapon that kind of needs more of a rework, or at least significant buff. The GooTuber, honestly, I don't know why I'm putting that up as high as I am, because I'm using the language of this. I think this one I want to put higher up to reflect that it has the better kit, but this one's still down here. I don't know why you would run it. Neo Sploosh, not enough range, only gets beacons. You don't need beacons, only gets whale, not a very high priority special. It's just not got a lot going for it. There's no part of its kit that's super desirable in the meta right now. Clash Blaster, we've talked about at some length. I've got a whole video on the weaknesses of Clash Blaster. Just doesn't splat someone fast enough for the range that it's got. If you want the nice slaying kit, you've got this weapon right up here, which does all of the same things, except it's actually paint positive. And the only difference is that it doesn't have quite the same AoE, but you can get the AoE from all of these mid-range weapons instead. Except for the squeezer. That doesn't count when I'm doing this. You know what I mean. Anyway, Luna's, it's too paint negative and too short range and too aim intensive. Like, aim intensive is a weird thing to say with something that has such a huge AoE radius, but if you're not hitting directs with a weapon that slow, a lot of the time you're just kind of dead anyway. The longer range AoE weapons can kind of poke at you over a ledge where you can't possibly shoot back, and a lot of the time that lets you actually pick someone off by using the AoE. But when you have to get this close to them, a lot of the time they can just drop and try to fight you and splat you to either trade or beat you outright if you miss shots before you can finish them off. I think this is another weapon that's nearing the point where it might need some kind of rework to really see value again. But we'll leave it here. There are things that it does, I think more so than down here. But there are definitely much better options for trying to accomplish what they accomplish. Paintbrush. I've said a lot of the weaknesses that I see in Paintbrush before. To recap, if you don't want to scroll back to Paintbrush Nouveau, that is very, very poor firing rate and relatively short range given how slow it fires. This one in particular doesn't have a great kit. The special is much less valuable than the missiles that the other ones have, and missiles are not even that great right now, so that's not even that big of a step up. It doesn't shark particularly well. You're usually going to trade if you're trying to shark. And if you're trying to shark, that means you're relatively paint negative. So you'd rather just have something like a Carbon Deco that's going to splat you faster and has multi-kill potential. The closest I'd go to it is an Octobrush, which, again, just faster kill time overall. Much less startup, able to actually surprise people. And it has a couple of kits really that I think synergize better than this particular kit does. I don't see this thing seeing any kind of competitive use until the main weapon gets significant mechanical buffs. We're talking like frame data type buffs, not points for special, not ink efficiency. I think it needs significantly more than that before we're ever going to see it at top level. Blue Goo, we already talked about, just not a very strong weapon. I don't see a reason to want to use it in competitive play. The undercovers, they jump higher now while they're shooting, which nobody asked for. It's kind of neat. Like, I like that they're adding things to it and that they know that they need to buff it, but like, that's not going to make it viable. It doesn't paint quite enough, doesn't paint for a good enough special on either kit. It's like we mentioned, splatter color screen, for all of the problems that it causes for people who have, sensory issues of whatever kind, unless it's up against someone who specifically has a medical reason that it's problematic for them, it's not doing that much. It's blocking your vision about as much as it's blocking the opponent's. when you go through the screen, if you're capable of, parsing the different colors once you get out the other side, it's not that disorienting. You just need like maybe half a second to readjust and be able to see everything you could see before. It does a little bit of damage, so if somebody's seeing you right as soon as you come through it, that might be a problem. But okay, it's very slow moving. You just plan to go through it in a certain position where you'll have cover once you get to the other side to heal off the damage. There's just not a lot that it does. And honestly, Reef Slider kind of does a little bit more than that does. So neither of them are really going to see any kind of use anytime soon. They just have too many losing matchups, not enough that they're going to accomplish, and there's not much that they do that's super unique that other weapons don't do significantly better. And then Clash Neo is one of my favorite punching bags in this game. We've talked about why I think the Clash as a main weapon is relatively weak, but the main Clash kit has Splat Bomb and Zuka, which are really good for an aggressive Slayer weapon. This has Curling Bomb, which can get it into places, but like, what can it do once it's into places? It needs to take cover once it gets into places. It doesn't really want to shark, it doesn't really want to rush at you, and that's what a Curling Bomb is really the best for. It has a poking option, but not a better one than a Splat Bomb in the Curling Bomb, so you'd probably prefer the main kit on the sub weapon. And then Super Chumps versus Trizuka. You take the Trizuka pretty much every time. Sure, you can use the Chumps, but they're definitely not a high value option compared to what you get out of a Zuka. So that just about does it. Obviously, as always, the hero shot just never really going to cut it. I don't foresee any buffs happening to this anytime soon. So just going to be permanently outclassed. Always pick the vanilla Splattershot. You're welcome.